After studying this module, you shall be able to know more about self knowledge, learn about the principles of self concept theory, identify the various aspects and sources of self knowledge, and understand the Indian perspective of self knowledge.
Self-knowledge refers to the knowledge of one's own mental states, beliefs, and desires. In psychology, it refers to the information that an individual gains when seeking an answer to the question, "Who am I?" It informs us about our mental representations of ourselves. It involves self-awareness and self-consciousness. One who lacks self-knowledge is ignorant about important aspects of his own self. There are many aspects of self-knowledge. The first is self-schemas. Self-schemas describe what we think about ourselves. Situations that are schema relevant set guidelines for our own behavior. However, not all self-schemas are positive. People also hold highly well organized beliefs about themselves regarding negative qualities. The second is self-discrepancies. According to Higgins, self-discrepancies produce strong emotions in people. When we perceive a discrepancy between our personal qualities and our ideal self, we experience disappointment, dissatisfaction, or sadness, and low self-esteem. Also, discrepancies between our actual self and what we think we ought to be, that is, our ideal self, produce emotions such as fear or anxiety. Discrepancies between the actual self and the ideal self also produce dejection, related emotions, and low self-esteem. Overall, we experience greater well-being when there is a fit between the goals that we are pursuing and our self-regulation orientation. The self-concept theory talks about 4 principles, namely reflected appraisals, social comparison, self-attributions, and psychological centrality. The principle of reflected appraisals holds that the self is a social product derived from the attitudes that others hold towards an individual. It also involves how the individual eventually sees himself as others see him. Social comparisons. People generally compare themselves with others. They judge and evaluate themselves in comparison to a particular individual, group, or social category. 2 bases that establish social comparisons are criteria and normative. Criteria comparison basis. When people compare themselves to others in terms of superiority or inferiority, or better or worse on some criteria of interest. Normative comparison basis fall along dimensions of deviance or conformity, or believing that one is in harmony with others or in disharmony to them. Self-attribution holds that just by observing their own actions and their outcomes, individuals draw conclusions about themselves. Psychological centrality explains that the self is an interrelated system of hierarchically organized components with some attributes and identities more important to the self. According to the self-concept theory, 2 key motives, self-esteem and self-consistency, help protect and maintain one's present self-concept when he or she observes, evaluates, and draws conclusions about oneself. Due to the self-esteem motive, individuals attempt to think well of themselves. It is often considered as universally dominant in the human motivational system by various self-theorists. The self-consistency motive states that people struggle to validate their self-concepts even when they are negative. Self-verification theory takes into account three basic assumptions with respect to self-conceptions. Self-concepts help guide people's behavior. They enable people to anticipate others' relations to their own behaviors, and they help organize people's notions of reality. Self-verification theory also states that people with negative self-conceptions often prefer negative evaluations from others. There are many ways to gain self-knowledge. The first is introspection. Introspection refers to thinking who we are by looking inward. It is believed that the more a person introspects about himself, the more he understands himself. By introspecting, people attempt to gain more knowledge about their hidden mental states. However, some theorists argue that introspection can also mislead us when we try to predict our feelings about something related to the future. This happens because we cannot correctly predict how we would feel in those situations as we are not yet there. But introspection is not always misleading. Introspection reveals the contents of consciousness, that is, people's current thoughts and feelings. For instance, in terms of conscious decision-making process, thinking about the reasons for a decision will actually lead us to accurate self-judgments. Self from the other's standpoint. When we analyze our behavior, we tend to attribute our own actions to external or situational causes. On the other hand, when we analyze the same behavior in others, we tend to attribute it to internal or dispositional causes. But if we will analyze our behavior from the observer's perspective, we are more likely to attribute it to dispositional factors. Predicting our behavior. Everyone makes mistakes while predicting their future behavior. For instance, newly married couples predict the longevity of their relationship more positively, while their family and friends often know better. Underestimating things is one of the most common errors in behavior prediction. For example, underestimating the time required to complete a task. This is known as the planning fallacy. Thus, the best way to make accurate predictions is to be more realistic about how long tasks took in the past. Next, predicting our feelings. According to Wilson and Gilbert, various studies have shown that people have greatest difficulty in predicting the intensity and the duration of their future emotions. Now let us understand, where does self-knowledge come from? Self-knowledge comes from socialization, that is, how a person acquires the rules, norms and values of his or her family, group and culture. By participating in important activities of our group, we start regarding these activities as important to ourselves as well. Socialization acts as the basis and formulation of our early experiences. The regularity of these experiences may eventually become internalized as important aspects of our self-concept. Reflected appraisal. Reflected appraisal refers to our perceptions of how other people react to us. People learn about themselves through the reactions of other people towards them. Cooley developed the concept of the looking glass self, which states that people perceive themselves as others perceive and respond to them. Feedback is also helpful in gaining knowledge about the self. People often give us explicit feedback about our qualities. According to Felsen and Reed, there is a strong relationship between what parents think of their children's abilities and children's own self-conceptions about these same aspects. Self-perception also helps people in inferring their personal qualities by observing their own behavior. Bem's self-perception theory also suggests that this source of self-knowledge is useful for aspects of the self that are not particularly central. Physiological arousal also helps people in inferring about their own personal qualities. We respond to things that we perceive and recognize our emotions by observing our mental and physiological reactions. However, since many emotional reactions are biochemically similar, we can distinguish high arousal from low arousal, but not specific emotions. Shaster's theory of emotions also helps us in understanding the circumstances in which our emotional states are ambiguous, and we must infer them by observing what goes on around us. The environment also provides us cues about our personal qualities. Our self-concept is heavily influenced by factors that make us unique. We often tend to mention things about ourselves that make us distinctive from others in any particular situation. Sometimes, when we want to evaluate ourselves on a particular dimension, we often indulge into social comparison. As a result, we assess our personal qualities by comparing ourselves to other people. Social identity is that part of the individual's self-concept which derives from his or her membership in a social group, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. These groups include family, religion, ethnic group, etc. Cross-cultural research has shown that self-concept varies depending on one's culture. Let us now understand the effects of focusing on one's feelings. It is often suggested that people should rather focus on the nature of the attitude than on analyzing the reasons for an attitude. Several studies have revealed that focusing on how one feels increases the accessibility of people's feelings and increases the extent to which these feelings predict people's subsequent behavior. However, Sylvia and Gondola argued that increased self-awareness increases people's motivation to act consistently with their attitudes. However, it does not necessarily increase people's awareness of their feelings. Various studies have found that writing about emotional or traumatic personal experiences has positive effects on health, academic performance, and job outcomes. Penbaker explains that initially writing exercise may provoke ruminative thoughts, but later people may gain greater understanding of the problem, thereby reducing disturbing thoughts and worries. There are other routes to self-knowledge also. For example, seeing ourselves through the eyes of others. A potential source of self-knowledge is other people. By carefully observing how other people perceive us and by noticing that their views are different from our own views, we can revise our self-concept accordingly. Several studies also focus on people's ability to detect accurately how other people view them when those views differ from their own views. It was found that rather than taking an objective look at how other people view them, people often assume that other people see them the way they see themselves. However, it is not always clear whose views are correct. For instance, there are times when people know themselves better than their peers know them. Next is inferring our non-conscious states from our behavior. According to the self-perception theory, forming our internal states from our behavior is a major source of self-knowledge, to the extent that when people's internal states are weak or ambiguous, they infer these states by observing their behavior and the related conditions and can use these behaviors as a clue to their hidden dispositions. Self-knowledge can be increased by reminding ourselves to be better observers of our own behavior and carefully examining our actions. This will help us in constructing self-narratives that correspond to our adaptive unconscious. Let us now understand the Indian perspective of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is called Atmagyan in Hindi. The knowledge of true self has always been the principal theme of the philosophy of Vedanta. Even in most ancient writings like the Upanishads, one can find about the importance of self-knowledge or Atmagyan, focusing that knowledge of the self lies at the root of all knowledge. In Vedanta, spirit is called the Atma or the cognizer, the perceiver and the subject. It is our true self. It is absolutely unchangeable. Self-knowledge reveals the knowledge of the real nature of the Absolute and of the Supreme Being. It does not only mean simply the knowledge of the lower animal self or ego, but also of the higher self. The higher self is the same as the Absolute, which lies at the foundation of the phenomenal universe. The true self, according to Vedanta, can never be destroyed. Self-knowledge alone helps us to realize the absolute truth. It is considered to be the highest wisdom. True self is the soul of our souls. Self-knowledge reveals that the attributes of God are also the attributes of the Atma. Those who do not realize their true self dwell in the darkness of ignorance and go through the misery and sufferings which exist in that darkness. They are always fearful, unhappy, and they make their life miserable by attaching themselves to a particular form of manifestation which they are afraid of losing. They love sense enjoyments and worldly pleasures. They feel disappointed and disconnected if they do not find these, and they consider that this earthly life has no other higher aim or ideal. Thus, knowledge of the self is very important as it destroys all worldliness, brings spiritual strength, and makes one fearless as God is fearless. Self-knowledge is the only source of happiness. It will lead to perfection and freedom.
Self-knowledge refers to the knowledge of one's own mental states, beliefs, and desires. In psychology, it refers to the information that an individual gains when seeking an answer to the question, "Who am I?" It informs us about our mental representations of ourselves. It involves self awareness and self consciousness. One who lacks self knowledge is ignorant about important aspects of his own self. According to Rosenberg, self knowledge is a component of the self concept. Self concept is the totality of an individual's thoughts and feelings about his or herself. It is tied to the I me dualism found in the self. There are two aspects of self knowledge. First are self schemas. They describe what we think about ourselves. Situations that are schema relevant set guidelines for our own behavior. People may hold highly well organized beliefs about themselves regarding positive or negative qualities. Another aspect is self discrepancy. According to Higgins, self discrepancies produce strong emotions in people. When we perceive a discrepancy between our personal qualities and our ideal self, we experience disappointment, dissatisfaction, and low self esteem. Thus, greater well being is achieved when there is a fit between the goals that we are pursuing, and our self regulation orientation. Self concept theory focuses on four principles. The principle of reflected appraisals holds that the self is a social product derived from the attitudes that others hold towards an individual. It also involves how the individual eventually sees himself as others see him. Principle of social comparisons explains that people judge and evaluate themselves in comparison to a particular individual, group, or social category. Self attribution holds that just by observing their own actions and their outcomes, individuals draw conclusions about themselves. Last principle, psychological centrality, explains that the self is an interrelated system of hierarchically organized components with some attributes and identities more important to the self. According to the self concept theory, self esteem and self consistency help protect and maintain one's present self concept. Self verification theory takes into account three basic assumptions with respect to self conceptions, which are that self concepts help guide people's behaviors. They enable people to anticipate others' relations to their own behaviors, and they help organize people's notions of reality. Self verification theory also states that people with negative self conceptions often prefer negative evaluations from others. Self concept is a social creation which is formed by a person's interaction with others, his past and present relationships, as well as his experiences within and across social contexts. The self concept has important consequences for action on both the individual and group. They not only influence the individual's cognitions, emotions, and behaviors, but also the groups and society to which a person belongs. In a nutshell, the self concept is a social force. There are various ways in which self knowledge can be acquired. First is introspection, which refers to thinking who we are by looking inward. By introspecting, people attempt to gain more knowledge about their hidden mental states. Another way is seeing the self from the other's standpoint. When we analyze our behavior, we tend to attribute our own actions to external or situational causes. But if we will analyze our behavior from the observer's perspective, we are more likely to attribute it to dispositional factors. Self knowledge can also be gained by predicting our behavior. However, underestimating things is one of the most common errors in behavior prediction. Another way is by predicting own feelings. There are various sources of self knowledge. Self knowledge comes from socialization, that is, how a person acquires the rules, norms, and values of his or her family, group, and culture. Another source is reflected appraisal, which refers to our perceptions of how other people react to us. Feedback is also helpful in gaining knowledge about the self. Self perception also helps people in inferring their personal qualities by observing their own behavior. We respond to things that we perceive and recognize our emotions by observing our mental and physiological reactions. The environment also provides us cues about our personal qualities. Our self concept is heavily influenced by factors that make us unique. Under comparative self assessments, we often indulge into social comparison to assess our personal qualities. According to Tatchfell, social identity is that part of the individual's self concept which derives from his membership in a social group together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. These groups include family, religion, ethnic group, etc. Cross cultural research has shown that self concept varies depending on one's culture. Introspection helps us in thinking about the reasons why we feel the way we do. According to Wilson, analyzing reasons leads to lower satisfaction in people with their choices, lower ability in people to predict their own behavior, and lower correlation between people's expressed feelings and their later behavior. The reason could be that people do not have complete access to their feelings and thoughts and develop an understanding based on incomplete information. It is often suggested that people should rather focus on the nature of the attitude than on analyzing the reasons for an attitude. According to Snyder, focusing on how one feels increases the accessibility of people's feelings and increases the extent to which these feelings predict people's subsequent behavior. However, Sylvia and Gendola argued that increased self awareness increases people's motivation to act consistently with their attitude, but it does not necessarily increase people's awareness of their feelings. In rumination, people in negative moods repetitively think about how they feel and why they feel that way without making any effort to improve their situation. According to Ward, it focuses on people's attention on negative aspects of their past and future, which leads to self defeating, negative interpretations of their problems and lowers their ability to find effective solutions to their problems. According to Penbaker, writing about emotional or traumatic personal experiences has positive effects on health, academic performance, and job outcomes. He explains that initially writing exercise may provoke ruminative thought, but later people may gain greater understanding of the problem, thereby reducing disturbing thoughts and worries. There are other routes to self knowledge as well. First is seeing ourselves through the eyes of others, which helps us revise our self concept accordingly. Second is inferring our non conscious states from our behavior. According to Bem's self perception theory, forming our internal states from our behavior is a major source of self knowledge. There are two nuances to the self perception process. Self revelation possibility holds that people have an internal state that they are not fully aware of. On the other hand, self fabrication possibility holds that people mistakenly infer the existence of a state that was not even present. A second nuance to self perception theory is associated with people's awareness of the inference process itself. People need to draw inferences consciously and deliberately. The self perception process, however, has been found to be quick and non conscious. Self conceptions have been found to be stable in nature. Various longitudinal studies have shown that people's self perception remains stable over periods as long as 35 years. According to Sheen, practitioners of brainwashing techniques in prisoner of war camps have also typically failed to change the self concepts of their captive despite their complete control over prisoners' physical and psychological environments. This shows that when people use systematic strategies in processing social feedback, they overestimate the actual amount of feedback that supports their self conceptions. Self knowledge is called Atmagyan in Hindi. The knowledge of true self has always been the principal theme of the philosophy of Vedanta. In Vedanta, spirit is called the Atma, which is our true self. It is absolutely unchangeable. Self knowledge reveals the knowledge of the real nature of the Absolute and of the Supreme Being. It refers to knowledge of the higher self. The true self, according to Vedanta, can never be destroyed. Self knowledge alone helps us realize the absolute truth. Those who do not realize true self dwell in the darkness of ignorance, are always fearful, unhappy, and make their life miserable. Thus, knowledge of self is very important. Self knowledge is the only source of happiness, perfection, and freedom. In this module, you have learnt that self knowledge is the knowledge of one's own mental states, beliefs, and desires. Self concept theory consists of reflected appraisals, social comparison, self attributions, and psychological centrality. According to self verification theory, self concepts help guide people's behaviors, enable to anticipate others' relations to their own behaviors, and help organize people's notions of reality. Self knowledge can be gained by introspection, looking at the self from the viewpoint of others, predicting our behavior and predicting our feelings. Self knowledge comes from socialization, reflected appraisal, feedback from others, self perception, labeling arousal states, environmental distinctiveness, and comparative self assessments. Writing about emotional personal experiences has positive effects on health, academic performance, and job outcomes. The Indian perspective gives a rich and varied understanding of self knowledge.